Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we share powerful tales of betrayal, redemption, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Today's story takes us through the devastating consequences of a man's selfishness and the final act of justice that changes life forever. Stay with us to witness the shocking truth that turns everything upside down. In the quiet, sterile halls of a Manhattan hospital, the rhythmic beep of medical machines echoed through the empty corridors. It was a sound Sarah Harper had grown accustomed to in her final months, a constant reminder of her fragile hold on life. At 36, Sarah had been a vibrant woman, full of life and ambition, but the relentless progression of cancer had drained her spirit, leaving her frail and weak. The once golden strands of her hair were replaced by soft silk scarves, gifts from her sister, Mia, who visited every week. But as the days wore on, Sarah found herself more alone than she could bear. Her husband, Mark, had been absent, not physically, but emotionally, and perhaps more so, mentally. He had stopped coming to the hospital regularly. His excuses now routine: an urgent meeting, an unexpected client, an important business deal that couldn't be delayed. Each time, Sarah swallowed the hurt and pretended to understand. But the truth gnawed at her. She had known him for 15 years. She knew his rhythms, his patterns, and she could tell something was changing. He wasn't the man who had promised to be by her side for better or for worse. Instead, he was becoming a stranger. That morning, as Sarah lay in her bed, her mind wandered. She absent-mindedly touched the diamond wedding ring that still clung to her finger, its size now too large for the emaciated form she had become. Mark was supposed to have been there yesterday, but there had been another meeting, another excuse. It stung, but Sarah had stopped expecting him to change. She had grown used to his absences, used to the lie he had quietly woven around her life. Her heart longed for him to come, to stand by her and prove that the vows they had once exchanged meant something. But deep down, she knew he was gone. Mia entered the room, her face flushed from the brisk New York City winter. She was always late, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to be upset. Mia was the only one who still cared, the one who understood her without words. The two women exchanged smiles, although Sarah's was weak. Traffic was a nightmare, Mia said, her voice rising with her usual energy. She had inherited their mother's fiery spirit, a contrast to Sarah's more reserved nature. But in the quiet of the hospital room, their differences didn't matter. Mia sat beside Sarah, taking her hand, her eyes red from crying. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Sarah lied. She always lied. "Just tired." Dr. Rachel Chun, Sarah's oncologist, entered the room next, her gentle footsteps a stark contrast to the chaos in Sarah's mind. She adjusted her glasses as she approached, the clipboard in her hands a constant reminder of the harsh truth. "Sarah," she began, her voice soft, "your latest scan results have come back, and we need to discuss them." Mia looked at Sarah, her hands squeezing Sarah's as they prepared for news they both feared. Rachel's face was unreadable as she began speaking, but Sarah had heard the tone before. She knew what was coming. The cancer was spreading more aggressively than anyone had hoped. The experimental treatments, the long nights, the endless visits to specialists, none of it had worked. Time, as always, was running out. 3 to 4 months, Rachel said finally, her words like ice. "Without intervention, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks at most." Sarah nodded, her body limp as the finality of those words settled in. Mia gasped beside her, her hand clutching Sarah's tighter as the tears she had tried to hold back finally spilled over. But Sarah didn't cry. She couldn't. There was no time left for that. She had already been grieving for months. And now, all that was left was this hollow acceptance. She would die, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Thank you for being honest with me," Sarah said, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the emotions swirling inside her. Rachel nodded and left, allowing the sisters a moment alone. Mia's voice broke through the silence. "We need to call Mark," she said, her words a sharp contrast to the peaceful stillness Sarah had wrapped herself in. "He should be here. He needs to know." "Don't," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. It's too late. Mia, he won't be here. He hasn't been for months. Mia's frustration was palpable, but Sarah couldn't find it in herself to fight anymore. The man she had loved, the man who had promised to always be there, had abandoned her. And the worst part was, Sarah wasn't surprised. The signs had been there for weeks. She had noticed the missing money from their joint accounts, the quiet, unexplained transactions, and the sudden influx of expensive gifts for someone else. But what truly broke her wasn't the money or the gifts. It was that Mark had stopped loving her, stopped even pretending. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Sarah's mind wandered to darker thoughts. But she wasn't going to cry. She had no tears left for him. Days passed, and the cold grip of Sarah's diagnosis tightened around her. The once vibrant woman who had danced through life, full of dreams and promises, now lay in a sterile hospital bed, watching as time slipped through her fingers. But the worst part wasn't the pain of the cancer, or the looming specter of her death. It was the realization that her marriage, her foundation, was crumbling before her eyes. Mia stayed close, but Sarah could feel the distance growing between them. She could feel the weight of the silence, the unspoken words that hung heavily in the air. Mia's anger at Mark was palpable, but it wasn't the anger that Sarah cared about. It was the sense of abandonment, the fact that even in the final days, Mark chose to be anywhere but here, with her. Then came the shocking discovery, one that changed everything. It started with a simple interaction, one that Sarah hadn't thought much about at first. She had been feeling increasingly nauseous, a side effect of the chemotherapy treatments. But one morning it felt different. This time, the nausea didn't ease. It intensified. The sinking feeling in her stomach told her something wasn't right. She had missed something, and it was there, staring her in the face. "What's today's date?" Sarah asked Mia one afternoon, her voice trembling. "October 15th. Mia replied, a frown crossing her face. "Why?" Sarah's hand shook as she touched her stomach, the realization dawning on her like a slow-burning fire. "I'm late," she whispered. The words hung in the air, and Mia's face contorted with shock. "What do you mean, late?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "Are you saying you're pregnant?" "I don't know," Sarah murmured, her breath catching in her throat. The doctors had told her repeatedly that chemotherapy made it impossible for her to conceive. But the signs were undeniable. The pregnancy test came back positive. "I can't be pregnant," Sarah whispered to herself as the weight of the revelation sank in. The doctor said, but Mia wasn't listening. "We need to tell Mark. He needs to know." "Sarah, he deserves to know." "No," Sarah said with surprising strength. "Not yet. I need time to process this. Mia, I need to think." The discovery of her pregnancy sent ripples through Sarah's world, transforming her final months into something more complicated than she had ever imagined. For a brief moment, there was hope, a new life growing inside her, a miracle amidst the devastation. But that hope quickly turned to fear. What did this mean for her? And what did it mean for Mark? Meanwhile, as Sarah's body grew weaker, Mark was living a different life entirely. While his wife fought for hers, Mark was living in luxury. The penthouse, the trips, the expensive jewelry. His mistress, Claire, had already begun to see the rewards of his betrayal. Mark was playing the role of the grieving husband, but his actions spoke volumes. He wasn't grieving. He was planning. One evening, as Sarah lay in her bed, unable to move, she overheard a conversation that would shatter everything she had left. "Do you think she'll even notice?" Mark's voice was low, almost whispering into the phone. "She's barely conscious most days. We can liquidate everything and take the money once she's gone." Sarah's heart stopped. She had heard enough. This wasn't just a betrayal of her body, but of everything they had built. The money, the plans, the life they were supposed to share. It was all slipping away. And worse, Mark wasn't even trying to hide it. The finality of it hit her harder than any diagnosis ever could. She wasn't just losing her battle to cancer. She was losing everything she had ever trusted. Tears filled her eyes as the cold, stark truth sunk in. The man she had married, the man she had loved, had already moved on. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She wouldn't let him take everything without consequence. Even in her weakest moments, she still had control over one thing: how the story ended. And she was going to make sure that Mark would never forget who he had been and what he had lost. Sarah's mind raced with a mixture of fear and resolve. She knew that her time was running out. But as her body deteriorated, her resolve only grew stronger. She had to make sure that Mark would face the consequences of his actions. But how? What could she do with so little time left? For the next few days, Sarah lay quietly in her hospital bed, the hum of the machines and the scent of antiseptic filling the sterile air. Mia stayed by her side, always there, always attentive. Yet, the growing tension between the two of them was impossible to ignore. Sarah could sense Mia's increasing frustration, her desire to confront Mark, to demand answers. But Sarah knew that confrontation wasn't the answer. Not yet. There were things to consider, and every move had to be carefully planned. Then came the phone call that Sarah had been waiting for. It was from Claire, Mark's mistress, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she listened to the woman's voice on the other end. "You need to tell him. Sarah, you need to tell him you're pregnant." Claire's voice was sweet, but there was an edge to it, a subtle malice that Sarah could sense even through the phone. "I've been waiting, but he won't leave you. Not until you do. You know that." Sarah's mind whirled with anger, but she bit her tongue. Claire was just another piece in Mark's twisted game, a game that Sarah refused to play. Instead, she remained silent, listening as Claire continued to speak. "You really think he'll stay with you through this? You're dying, Sarah, and you think he'll give up everything for you? You know he won't. So tell him now. Tell him you're pregnant. It'll make the break easier." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as Claire's words hit their mark. But instead of responding, Sarah quietly ended the call. She had to get a grip. She wasn't about to give Mark the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. He had no idea what he was dealing with. But soon, he would. Later that evening, Sarah called Mia into her room. She couldn't do this alone anymore. "Mia," Sarah said, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "I need you to help me. We need to make sure Mark understands what he's done." Mia looked at her with concern, sensing the weight of her words. "What do you mean? You don't have much time left." "Sarah, I don't want you to waste what little time you have." "I'm not wasting it," Sarah replied softly. "I just need to make sure that Mark remembers what he did to me, to us. I won't let him get away with this. Not without paying the price. He's been so consumed by greed and selfishness that he's forgotten what really matters. But I'll make sure he never forgets." Mia hesitated but nodded, understanding the gravity of what Sarah was asking. "What do you want me to do?" "I need to talk to my lawyer," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I need to revise my will." Mia's eyes widened. "But Sarah, the will, you're talking about your inheritance. The house, everything you've built. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Sarah said firmly. "Mark is going to think he can get away with it all, but I'm going to make sure he doesn't. He may have my inheritance, but I'll take something from him he'll never be able to replace: his peace of mind." The next day, Sarah's lawyer arrived, his face grim but understanding. They went through the details, Sarah dictating every decision with precision, ensuring that Mark would not see a penny of her inheritance. Instead, it would go to the hospital foundation, to cancer research, something that would continue to fight for those who had been abandoned, just as she had been. The properties, the money, everything Mark thought he would inherit, it would all be redirected, leaving him with nothing. But Sarah didn't stop there. She had one final act of vengeance, one last twist of the knife. She had arranged for a letter to be sent to Mark after her death, a letter that would make him face the truth he had been running from all along. "I'm leaving you one final gift, Mark," Sarah whispered as she signed the documents. "A gift that will haunt you for the rest of your life." Mia watched her, silent tears in her eyes. She knew Sarah was doing this not out of hatred, but out of love, a love that Mark had taken for granted, a love that would now live on in the choices Sarah had made. As Sarah lay back in her bed, exhausted but resolute, she knew her time was drawing to a close. She had done what she could. She had ensured that Mark would never forget her. that he would carry the weight of his betrayal with him for the rest of his life. And now, she could finally rest. The days grew shorter, and Sarah's condition worsened. The weight of her decisions pressed heavily on her chest, but she couldn't regret them. Each move she made had been calculated, every choice rooted in the determination to leave a legacy, one that would not be forgotten. Despite the pain and the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She had found a way to make Mark face the consequences of his actions, and she could finally close her eyes knowing that he would not escape the truth. No matter how hard he tried, Mia stayed by her side, unwavering in her support. She held Sarah's hand through the worst of it, always there, always ready to fight for Sarah's last wishes. Though their conversations had grown fewer, the bond between them was stronger than ever. Mia had come to understand Sarah's need for justice in a way that no one else could. She had seen the depth of Sarah's love for Mark, and she had seen the cruelty with which he had shattered it. It was late one afternoon when Sarah's lawyer arrived with a package, sealed and final. He had been instructed to deliver it to Mark once Sarah had passed, as per her final wishes. As the lawyer handed over the envelope to Mia, his face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes held an understanding that went beyond words. He had been with Sarah through it all, and he knew what this moment meant. "This is it, Mia," the lawyer said softly. "Everything is in place." Sarah made sure Mark would have no escape from her last gift. He will be forced to reckon with his betrayal. Mia nodded, clutching the package tightly in her hands. She hadn't yet processed the weight of the loss she would soon feel. She had been Sarah's unwavering companion through her illness, and now she would fulfill Sarah's final wish, no matter how painful it might be. That evening, the snow began to fall, blanketing the world outside in a layer of white. It was the same kind of peaceful silence that Sarah had always loved. Mia sat by Sarah's side, her eyes wet with the promise of tears she refused to shed just yet. She had not been ready to say goodbye. Not yet. But she knew that this was the end of Sarah's battle. And soon, the world would be left to pick up the pieces. At dawn the next day, Sarah passed quietly in her sleep, with Mia holding her hand, whispering words of love and final farewells. She had fought so hard, had loved so deeply, and had left a part of herself behind, her strength, her resilience, and her final act of justice. Mia didn't waste time. She immediately called Sarah's lawyer, and with her instructions clear, she began making the final arrangements. She knew that it would not be easy, but she had made a promise to Sarah, and she was determined to see it through. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, and Mia had no intention of letting Mark off lightly. When he arrived, dressed in a suit that barely hid his unease, he played the role of the grieving husband, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, pretending to mourn the woman he had betrayed so horribly. He arrived just in time for the service, slipping in through the back, but his eyes didn't meet Mia's. He couldn't. Mia stood at the front of the room, her expression composed but firm. She had known all along that Sarah had seen through Mark long before anyone else had. She had known that this day would come, and now she was ready for it. As the service continued, Mia felt a strange sense of calm. This was it. The end of Sarah's pain and the beginning of Mark's reckoning. 3 days later, Mark sat in the lawyer's office, his face ashen as the will was read aloud. His anger began to boil as he listened to the terms of Sarah's final wishes. The inheritance, the properties, everything gone. All of it had been redirected to the charities Sarah had carefully chosen. The money he had spent on the penthouse, the vacations, the jewelry, all of it would be seized and donated to cancer research, to those who had been affected by the same disease that had taken his wife from him. Then came the final revelation. James sat frozen, his breath catching in his throat as the lawyer handed him a letter. With trembling hands, he opened it and began to read, his voice shaking as the truth finally sank in. "My dearest James, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will discover the full extent of your betrayal. I knew about Sarah, about the penthouse, about the money. I knew about everything. I knew you were never really there for me. But this letter isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. Look into the mirror. James, and face the man you've become. This is my gift to you, one that will haunt you for the rest of your life. I hope you learn from it. I hope you remember what you lost." The silence that followed was unbearable, as the lawyer continued to explain the final arrangements, including the mirror Sarah had left James, a gift that would reflect not just his face, but the man he had allowed himself to become. And as James stared into the mirror, the truth became impossible to ignore. His world, built on lies and deceit, had crumbled, and now he had nothing left but the harsh reality of his own reflection. As James sat in the conference room, the weight of his betrayal hung like a storm cloud overhead. His eyes, wide with disbelief, never left the letter as he read the final words from Sarah. She had seen through him, through his false pretenses, and even in her last moments, she had managed to make sure he would never forget what he had done. The inheritance, the penthouse, the lavish gifts, everything he had stolen, spent, and squandered, was now gone. His attempts to bury the truth, to silence the pain he had caused, were in vain. The truth had been set in motion, and now it was inescapable. James felt as if the ground beneath him was slipping away. The life he had once known, the power he had held, all seemed so distant now. It was no longer about the money or the status. It was about Sarah and the brutal consequences of his own actions. The lawyer continued speaking, detailing the dissolution of his assets, the reallocation of his inheritance, and the charities that would benefit from Sarah's final wishes. But James wasn't listening. The words were a blur as he clutched the letter, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. His mind raced with anger and frustration. He had never believed Sarah capable of orchestrating such a thing. He had thought her weak, fragile, someone to be controlled. But now, he saw the depth of her strength, her resilience in the face of everything he had done. Mia, sitting silently in the corner, watched James' downfall with a cold satisfaction. She had always known that Sarah was the stronger of the two, that she had always loved James more than he deserved. And now, she was seeing the culmination of Sarah's final act of justice. Sarah had known what needed to be done, and she had done it with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. James, on the other hand, was losing everything, but it wasn't just the money or the material possessions that were slipping through his fingers. It was his very identity, the one he had built on lies and deceit. For the first time in years, he saw himself clearly, stripped of his illusions. He had been an unfaithful husband, a man driven by greed and selfishness. And now, in the silence of the lawyer's office, he was forced to confront the man he had become. The truth cut deeper than any loss of wealth ever could. The realization of what he had done to Sarah, to their unborn child, and to the family they might have had, left him hollow. The betrayal had cost him everything, but it had also exposed the darkness within him, a darkness that could never be erased. He had no way to undo the damage he had caused. He couldn't change the past. But Sarah, in her final act, had given him one last chance to face the consequences, to see the man he had become, and, perhaps, to change. Mia stood up, walking over to James with a steady gaze, her voice quiet, but full of conviction. She wanted you to remember, James, every single day. When you look in the mirror, you'll remember what you did. You'll remember the choices you made, and the family you lost. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what it means to be better than who you were. The finality in Mia's words echoed through the room. And for the first time, James didn't argue. He couldn't. There was no defense, no excuse for the choices he had made. His world, the one he had spent years constructing, had shattered in a single moment. And now, he had nothing left but the cold reality of his actions, reflected back at him in the harsh light of truth. As he left the lawyer's office, the weight of Sarah's final words still hanging heavily on his chest, James walked through the streets of Manhattan like a man who had been stripped of everything. His reputation, his fortune, his self-respect, all gone, and all that remained was the reflection of a man who had destroyed his life in pursuit of selfish desires. He knew now that he could never undo the past, But as he walked home that evening, the reality of his new life began to settle in. He had nothing left, nothing but his reflection, and the harsh truth that came with it. Back in her apartment, Mia looked out over the city. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, a reminder of the quiet justice that had been served. Sarah's legacy would live on, not in the money or the properties, but in the lives that would be touched by her generosity, her strength, and her unwavering sense of justice. And in James, the man who would now spend the rest of his days facing the truth of what he had done and what he had lost. Thank you for watching this emotional journey with us. We hope today's story has touched your heart and sparked reflection. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with those who might find solace or inspiration in it. Stay tuned for more stories that truly matter.